Hi guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. This is an A-level geography video where I will be sharing tips on studying. Before I begin, if you are in need of a geography teacher, please contact the number above. I have carefully chosen 8 important tips that I think would be very useful to any A-level geography student. So let's get started. Tip number 1. My very first tip would be to read ahead, and I think this is very important because it allows you to take some time into understanding certain concepts and grasping certain things your own way, because usually tutors or teachers teach you things according to how they understood something. So taking time to understand something on your own removes that element of confusion, especially during lessons. Moving on to tip number 2, which is constantly going over your notes. I believe this is a very crucial part to studying because I believe repeating allows things to stick and it gives you time to understand your content rather than cram your content. And one thing I've picked up on is that every time you repeat something, you learn something new, or you pick up on something that you hadn't picked up the first time that you had gone through the content. And avoiding learning things the night before the exam eliminates the element of cramming. Tip number 3 would be to learn your case studies as you go. Again, I believe repeating your content makes learning much easier, and with things like dates, things like specific names, and things like numbers, often learning these things is very difficult and is very hard to do at once. But the more you repeat these things, the easier it becomes for you to remember. And usually learning your case studies as you learn the other components of your syllabus makes learning far much easier because you're using real life examples to explain what you're supposed to learn. Tip number 4 would be to go back to your IGCSE or your O-level notes. And I think this is very important because most of the A-level topics are in addition to what you already know. So your topics like agriculture, your population, your settlement, your environmental management are things that were briefly covered during your IGCSE years or your O-level years. And so it's important that you have the basics, that you laid a foundation to what you're supposed to then learn during your A-levels. You can also consider using some of your IGCSE case studies as long as you are able to incorporate more detail and as long as you're able to expand on what you already know. And I think this makes life way easier because you're merely building up on things that you've already learned. Moving on to tip number 5, which is not allowing yourself to be restricted. What I mean by this is that usually the content of the syllabus is split into major topics, for example, population or settlement, and this puts you in a state where you feel like when answering questions based on population or answering questions based on agriculture, then you have to stick to what you've learned under that topic. But then one thing I have noticed is that it's very useful for you to link what you've learned, because most of the time what you've learned under population is related to what you learned under settlement, or what you learned under agriculture is related to what you learned under environmental management. And I think this puts you out of the box and it separates you as you are trying to make linkages between what you're learning, which would help in showing that you actually understand what you're learning rather than just learning for the sake of passing the exam. My 6th tip to you would be to explore beyond your notes. So you can do things like watching the news, or reading beyond your textbook. So look for things like articles that look interesting or sound interesting to you, and in general just paying attention to detail around you, because you may find that this may be an easier alternative to learning case studies that are in the book, because geography is all about what's happening around you. Tip number 7 would be to make sure that you've understood concepts, you've understood what you're being taught as you're being taught. There's nothing that's worse than sitting in a classroom, not understanding and ignoring it up until you write exams, because this only allows you to stress yourself even more, especially during exam time. My final tip for you would be to know your learning style, and I think this is something that you can only pick up on if you make an effort to look into the different types of learning until you eventually find what works best for you. Because one thing I've noticed is that what works for someone else may completely put you off, and each and every individual is different. So I think it's very important that you take time into looking into what's best for you. That brings us to the end of the video. Thank you for putting your time and effort into watching the video. If you found this useful, please comment, share, and subscribe.